Hi, everyone. This is Chinmay, and I'm here with Karen Hagens. Hey, Karen, how are you?
Hey, great. Nice to be here.
Absolutely nice to have you on, and thanks for taking the time. Karen is a healthcare leader with over 20 years of industry experience, especially in the communication space. She's worked with various types of healthcare and life sciences organizations, big and small, and she also brings her former reporter lens into this conversation. And so excited to have this conversation with you around the topic of communications within the healthcare life science, especially for senior leaders. And when we think about early stage life sciences companies, they're usually founded by scientists and technical leaders, brilliant at the science. That's why the company exists, but brilliance in the lab doesn't necessarily carry into the room of investors, board, and other constituents. So when you think about the skill that builds the company is not necessarily just the science component, but it's communication that helps get it funded and get it covered and get it across the board. And so with that in mind, can you talk to a little bit more about that component a little bit from your experience?
Sure. I think it's a common challenge that a lot of companies have in terms of, just as you said, they're brilliant at the science. They've got a great molecule to bring to the market, but maybe they don't know exactly how to talk about it or how to share it with different audience members, whether that be investors, whether that be pharma life science leaders, and future consumers. So that's a lot about what we're going to get into and really dig into that a bit today.
Yep, exactly. Great. Yeah.
You're locked in to Burn the Blueprint podcast, where Tony Tidbit and Dr. Bridget Cooper challenge outdated rules and build smarter ways to lead. If you're ready for courage, clarity, and real talk, you're in the right place. All right, team, what blueprint are we burning today?
What part of the story do investors want to hear?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, you're asking about the investors because investors listen differently than others, and they're listening for one thing first. They're listening first of, can I believe this story? Is there something in here for us? And everything is filtered through that question and that lens for them. So, for example, investors think about the headline first. What's the big picture? And then the data. And they really dig into the data and drill down. Most founders, however, when they talk about their molecule and their product and company, they do it backwards. They talk about things inversely. They talk about all the details. And that's usually the challenge. Investors, they want the market opportunity. They want to know the size of the prize. They want to know why now. They want to know all of that before they look at a single number. And in particular, they want to know what's our money going to buy? What's the next milestone? What's the timeline? And what is actually hitting that going to mean for the company's value? A second piece I would also say is they want to know, why does this company make a difference? What is it about the science of the company that makes it different? But not just the science. What about the people? What about the leadership team? What makes you unique, different, and qualified to bring the company and the molecule or molecules forward? And that's the part I think that gets skipped a lot in terms of that leadership storytelling. So that's one piece that I talk about. Another piece I would say is that the risks. So we all know, no matter which therapeutic area you're talking about, which molecule, there are unknowns and there are risks that are on your path. Talking about those is important, and being truthful about them and naming them instead of just burying them or not discussing them, especially with the investor audience, because the fastest way to lose an investor is to make them feel like they have to dig for what could go wrong. Just name it, talk about how you're addressing it and what your protocols are, and move forward. So in summation for that piece, I would just say, they come for the story, but they really love the details. I say that most investors know companies better than the people in the companies themselves half the time, but they need a reason to believe first. Give them that reason to believe and then go into the details.
Yeah, that's very well said. On a similar note, if you think about pharma execs, what part of the story do they want to hear?
Yeah, again, different audience, similar, but different, because they're not asking necessarily, should I bet on this? They're asking, where does this fit? Does this fit into our portfolio, what we're trying to do? Could it? What's the future hold here? So it's much more of a focus on strategic fit first. So when you're talking to life science leaders, executives in the space, not necessarily investors, you have to think about that strategic fit first and talk about the market positioning and not necessarily the science. The science will come, that's important, obviously, but talk about that market position, where this slots into their portfolio, where it slots into their pipeline, how is it parallel, how is it synonymous with what they're already doing. If they cannot see the match in the first 2 minutes, it doesn't matter what else you say. They're just gone. They just have to get to it. So the challenge with this one also is that most founders open with the science. That's their comfort. So you lose them there a lot before you get right to the fit. So you've got to get to that quickly. And a lot of times overselling is the fastest way to lose them in terms of, getting really into the details. And they do need to know some things, right? They need to know the basics of mechanism of action, how it's different from the standard of care, what's proven, what's still to be proved, because they're going to spot a gap if you have some known facts on what's proven and what is still yet to be proved. Same theory here, be honest, be truthful, because they're going to identify those facts. So name it before they do. You're going to get a lot of authenticity and knowing the space by doing that. So that's one piece of advice. And the other piece I would say is talk their commercial language, speak in the language that they understand, and follow that path of explaining to them about how this fits into or could potentially fit in long range market access. What's the payer view? What's the real world usage? The patient journey? What's the unmet need, right? Don't say things like it's a huge market. That's not the same. That's not the language that they use. So match the language they use, and that helps a bit.
Yeah, that's well said as well. And it's good to keep those perspectives in mind as we move forward. One, investors, different constituency, kind of similar in nature, of course, but at the same time, different constituencies, a slightly different approach than taking forward pharma execs. But considering keeping those two in mind, why is this so hard for scientists and founders to do as far as being able to storytell amongst those two constituents?
Yeah. I mean, storytelling is an art, right? It's, you think about it, you take somebody that might have taken 10, 15 years to develop a molecule or work on a portfolio, and it is their lifeblood. They know the science inside and out, and they are trained. Usually these technical leaders are trained to be absolutely precise, complete, and careful. That's right for science, but that's a wrong element and approach for storytelling. Storytelling is about, around the circle, coloring outside of the lines, envisioning what could be. And oftentimes, a lot of these founders, they don't often think about the different audiences either. We just walk through the audiences. That's a slightly different approach that you would take depending on which audience you're thinking about. A lot of times founders they tell their story, rinse and repeat. They tell their story to a different audience without understanding that there's a level of connection that has to happen there based on not what they need to say, but what does the audience need to hear to be able to connect and understand. The other thing I would say is that scientists are often rewarded for nuance and caveats, and investors and reporters in particular need almost the opposite. That shift doesn't come naturally. It's very black and white thinking that they have. And a lot of clients that I work with, this is a challenge that they have because they feel like they're giving up a little bit of their scientific credibility because they see storytelling as spin, if you will. And I understand where they're coming from. But if people don't understand what you're trying to do, and you can't communicate that, and you can't give them the vision and understand where you're trying to go, then all of the work that you've put in is for naught, right? Because it's not going to get the respect, understanding that you could have had otherwise. At the end of the day, it's translation. You're translating your science to real world language that people can understand and appreciate. So that's how I talk to them about it. It takes some time sometimes with scientists to get them to come to that spot.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen it too, right? But it's, many scientists are passionate about their science, right? And
as they should be.
And rightfully so. But I think when it comes to actually securing that next major decision, it's I'd say an evolved language beyond just the science, right? Which can really help the company move forward. We also understand that's true to your point, right? Not all scientific founders are made for storytelling. So could you describe the characteristics that scientific founders must have to be able to make this transition successfully?
Yeah, I think the good news is I think storytelling is a learnable skill. As we've talked about, not every founder, whether they're a scientist or non-scientist, is necessarily, it has it innately, but as long as they're ready to learn it, I think they can. I think there are a few things you have to have in place first to be able to move that forward. I think self-awareness about what the gap is between knowing the science and telling the story, and recognizing that you can know the science really well and not be able to tell the story well. And having that perspective and that willingness to be able to put in the time to be able to be coached on the hard things at that senior level. When I've seen senior execs willing to be coached and be vulnerable and open-minded to this, that opens up a whole new capability in them to be able to change the way they tell their story. So those conversely that say, I already have this, I know how to tell the story, I know the science, and kind of heads down, it just doesn't translate. It stays there. And that's their perspective. I think the other thing is we all know you play how you practice. And
Right.
so taking the time and being disciplined to practice, you'd be surprised. A lot of leaders that I think are the best speakers, they make it look so effortlessly, but I would argue that it's probably the ones that practice the most and think about it the most that are the best at what they do. They just make it look effortlessly, but they put in the time. So I would say putting the time is
Right.
important. And curiosity about the audience, of really thinking about, what do they need to hear? What questions will they have? What do I need to overcome with this audience to get them to understand and believe and do something differently after I speak to them? And not just saying the same thing over and over again, but really thinking about the audience in mind. You can have the same messages and it's a puzzle piece, right? Thinking about how you
Right.
tell the story in a different way to a
Yeah.
different audience. That's important. The so what test, I think another important piece of, you can give all the details, but at the end of the day, so what? What does this mean? What does all of this mean for patients, for the industry? Why should anyone care? And if you're not making that connection in your conversations, in your stories, then you haven't crossed the bridge in storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it too, but there's so much great innovation in our space in healthcare life sciences, but it doesn't necessarily translate into what's being prioritized by senior leaders, either on the pharma side or the investor side, because it's that gap, right? And so, and having those traits, for scientific founders can also go a long way for the company, right? I mean, you have to put the company first in that sense.
Absolutely. I think that also, back to your point, is the companies that do a great job that tell their story. And you can have another company that has great science, and you say to yourself, why is this company over here getting such great recognition, have such a great reputation? They've invested behind it. They're telling the stories, and they're being very thoughtful about it and how they talk about it themselves externally. And maybe this one is much more quiet about it, not telling the stories. And maybe this one over here even has better science. It doesn't always equate. It's just about that ability to go out and talk about it externally and get the excitement from all the communities, investors, life science, patients, et cetera, to what could the future hold and what does the science mean moving forward.
Yeah, that's well said. The other thing I'll just mention really quickly is, especially from an investor hat, I've interacted with several investors who potentially said they saw a company that's being presented, had good science. There's a saying in the investor community, right, is would you bet on the jockey, not always the horse, maybe just as much as on the jockey than the horse, right? Investors are very intuitive, right? And so if they pick up on those traits on, hey, look, I realize that this senior executive trying to lead this company is a scientific founder, naturally CSO, but has really worked on their communications and ability to communicate the story back out. That's a good sign, because guess what? Down the road, if there's a pivot that needs to be made, that's a sign of this person's willing and able to listen and be open-minded as far as the future direction of the company. And so there's always that bit of a nuance that investors pick.
Absolutely, because it goes back to the point of not just about the science, but who's leading and why is this company different, and
Right.
why do we trust this leadership team? They're looking at all the pieces.
Right. Exactly. So can you tell me about a leader who actually made this shift? What did they do and what did that look like?
Yeah, actually, I love this story, and, I wish I could name him. I can't. It's a client privilege, but I had a privilege of working with a great leader this past year, and he was a chief medical officer for a biotech, and he was brilliant, is brilliant on the science, just absolutely brilliant. But he was rigidly black and white. That's just how he was trained, right? And English was not his first language, is not his first language. And so he was very much just like, well, this is how I was trained. This is what I say. They ask me this question. And I was brought in to help him communicate differently and better to the investor audience in particular, for quarterly earnings and so forth. And really had to work with him to think about the audience first and really talk about that investor audience. What do they need? What do they want to hear? How do you tell that big picture story first and show them and give them the context? Investors want to know, yes, they want to know the details, but they're looking for a little bit something more. Can you share the context with me? What are you seeing in the data? You can't go too far out. Obviously, it's a public company. You have to be very careful. You can't step outside the lines, but there's somewhere in that middle that you can give them the context that gives them the ability to tell and write their analyst notes, and for reporters to write their stories, that gives them that inside view. And for a leader like him, he wasn't telling that story. He was very much answering the question in a single sentence with no context, no follow-up, but let me lead you back to the bigger picture and what we're doing next and what this means and how this connects to our prior study, etc. And so obviously the course result, I worked with him for many months in working on this. And he, back to the early question about what you have to do to make this work and get better at storytelling, he put in the practice time. I mean, I assigned him homework, and let me tell you, he did it. And that doesn't always happen either. He did his homework. He put in a lot of time with me practicing. We approached it with a lot of stakeholder feedback from his CEO, from his IR counterparts, his CFO, and he got dramatically better to the point of it was marked on his investor calls, where he was a different presenter and a different leader by the time that rolled around a few quarters later, of how he was answering questions and broadening out his answers. It was great. I loved working with him, because it really, you could see the difference for him.
Yeah, well said. And what was the turning point, right? Or was there something specific that happened throughout the process that really catapulted?
Question. I think that a lot of executives put this lower in the totem pole, right? You've got so many competing priorities. And I don't think that communications, and whether that's media training, whether that's getting ready for an IR analyst meetings, et cetera, and how to storytell, how to be really a better communicator, is probably not at the top of their list, unless it's been flagged to you from, somebody within your organization that you need to get better at this. I don't think it's something they put at the top of their list. And he was really self-aware about it. He knew he needed to get better, and he was willing to put in the hard work. So that willingness, that vulnerability to be coached one-on-one, that was really important, I think, for him to be able to do that. And he put in his own time, and that we had clear, measurable objectives with others monitoring his improvement. So it wasn't just he felt like he got better and we moved on, but he was scoring himself and others were scoring him over specific measurable goals, which I'm a big believer in this function as well.
Yep. That's fantastic. And you mentioned media training as one of those kind of focused moments and focused areas. What does that actually look like? Why does that matter so much?
Yeah. So a lot of executives will say, I've done media training. And that's true. Many of them have, right? But I often encourage people, do it again. Do it before you're going for a big raise or for, big presentation or, what have you, many different times in your career, because it changes, and that refresher is always important. Media training isn't about scripting someone. It's highly individualized. The work is twofold. It's giving a leader a set of tools that allows them to stay on message and get them comfortable in using those standard tools in a way that feels natural to them and not rehearsed. So it allows them to be their best selves, but gives them the guardrails to stay on message, knowing the rules of engagement before they walk in. So the first biggest guard rule is you're always on record. I'm a former reporter, and one of the things that we try to do is get people to tell us things that they don't want to tell us.
Right.
Or shouldn't tell us. A casual aside, that's a trick of the trade, and you can't fall for those tricks. There's no exceptions there. So that's one piece. And being comfortable in the message and knowing that those guardrails allow you to sound natural and stay safe in those specific message zones, that's what helps you have a great outcome, no matter what type of situation you're entering. And that helps you throughout your career. So to me, it should never be a one and done, which a lot of executives say, I've done media training, I don't need to do it again. It should be about preparing then for that next engagement and that specific opportunity if you have something coming up.
Yeah. And so kind of those combination is just comes down to, all right, well, this person's taking a different mentality to this than they had before, right? And it's just staying conscious about those two specific components, which is, one, you're always on, so you remember that, and the two, what are the guardrails, right? And can you navigate amongst those guardrails? And anything beyond that, maybe a leader might have to think quickly on their feet, as they may have done before in front of other investors, execs, things like that. But it's sticking within that guardrail, which really helps guide the conversation discussion even further.
Yeah. And you're going to get better over time. I don't know. I can share an example with you of one.
Please. Yeah.
That is a little bit of what not to do. And I think sometimes we learn more from this what not to do. I don't know. Did you see the GameStop CEO? It's outside of healthcare, but did you see that interview on CNBC?
I heard about it, but I missed it. So you fill me in, please. What happened?
Okay. You definitely need to watch it. It's on YouTube because it is the quintessential. It is now the new quintessential what not to do in terms of media interviews. So their CEO, GameStop CEO, Ryan Cohen, went on CNBC after a surprise bid for eBay. And he was pressed on how he would finance it. And he kept repeatedly pointing viewers. He kept saying, well, it's on the company website. The information's all there. And I have never seen, anchors Becky Quick and Andrew Ross Sorkin. I've never seen them they didn't even know how to ask him a follow-up question. They were absolutely laughing because it was so awkward. He couldn't give an answer. It was really, really bad. Either he had never been media trained or he didn't remember his media training. It's so bad that the stock fell afterwards. So we laugh, but these things have impacts to companies because he was the face of the company.
Right.
And, the teaching point there is, you can't point a reporter to the website. That's not an answer. He was on TV to answer the questions and give the context and tell the story, right? He's in the hot seat. He's got to answer the questions. And he just walked in, obviously, without preparing any of the answers to the obvious questions that were to come through. They were really basic, like, tell me the math.
Right.
And so he wasn't prepared. So that's one of my media tenets for media training is you have to prepare for the interviews and you have to be prepared for specific scenarios. If you're going on CNBC, here's what to expect. If you're going to talk to Bloomberg, here's what to expect, right? So that is a recent one that was a real doozy. So
I'll definitely have to take a look, but thank you. That's very helpful. And can you elaborate on another example where the senior leader kind of forgot that, look, you're in a reporter situation, you ended up building too much rapport with the reporter, right? And what did that lead to?
Yeah, a few of those, but one I would say is a senior executive I worked with at a large pharmaceutical company. She just got too comfortable with the reporter, treating it more like a friendly conversation and just didn't follow that rule of keeping your guard up a bit. And she said something about a competitor and that became the headline. I remember walking out of the room with her and I said, you said X, Y, and Z, and that is going to be the headline of the story. And that's not good. And she goes, I know, I messed up. And I said, okay, we'll move forward. She learned, right?
Right.
And
right.
the teaching point is you're always on record. Like you can't give them headlines that you don't want to be headlines. You have to stay on message. And she just got too comfortable. And that's where practicing, doing enough media and having the media training and having that practice session back and forth and having somebody in the room with her afterwards to kind of be the conscious monitor, if you will, that a lot of communicators are, I think helped her improve over time. But yeah, it was rough. It was a rough headline.
Okay, helpful, yeah. So considering that, right, I mean, just to bring it together a little bit, one leader had no prep, the other forgot the guardrails, both are avoidable. Sounds like media training is not a nice to have or a one-time check the box approach, right? It's the difference between leader being able to carry the company story into a very high stakes moment. And that's when it becomes really real. And so speaking of media training as a whole, is that a one-time thing or is that something that leaders need to?
Yeah, I mean, I said this earlier that I think it depends, right? So leaders who've been trained once assume they've got it handled. That's very common, but that confidence is exactly the risk, right? Core training is the foundation, but it's not the finish line. So, refreshers matter at those inflection points, whether that's a new company, a new role, new messages, a new milestone, a high stakes moment ahead. I recommend those throughout your career as an executive as you grow and throughout different company milestones. So I think there's no one size fits all, but I do recommend it based on the company milestones. And the leaders who stay sharp are the ones who keep practicing in between sessions. It doesn't have to include someone like me, but it's ones that don't just check the box and say, I did that, I'm done, I've got this. Because building those reporter relationships helps you over time because then the reporters come back to you and say, I trust this executive. I believe what they're going to say. I'm going to call them when X, Y, and Z happens, or I want somebody to comment on this industry trend, or I'm going to watch their company a little bit closer because I built up a rapport with them. So it's not just about doing the one-off interview. It's about allowing that executive to authentically build that relationship so that there becomes this trusted professional engagement that happens there. That's where the magic really happens.
Well said. Well said. Well, Karen, that was very helpful. Thank you so much. A lot built into this dialogue here, and some takeaways for me are start with the audience, not the science. Get to the so what, so answer the so what. And it sounds like storytelling is a learnable skill, and the leaders who put in the time really get better. And finally, media training is not a check the box approach, right? It's not a one-time thing. It's the difference between carrying the story into that big moment. And so thank you so much for all of that and for the time and the discussion here. And as a final word, if you'd like to get in touch with me or my guest, or if Peak can help you and your life sciences company grow, reach out to us in the comments below or email us at cs@grow@peak.com. Great. Well, Karen, thanks again. It's been very great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.